Meet Dado Valentic, the visionary who redefined color in film and television. From pioneering digital cinematography to helping make HDR industry standard, from shaping the look of Slumdog Millionaire, Sherlock Holmes, and Game of Thrones, to developing film emulation tools used by thousands of professional colorists. From running an award-winning post facility to creating Colourlab AI, bringing Hollywood-grade color to creators worldwide. A color scientist, educator, and innovator with one mission: to teach machines how to see beauty the way we do.
My name is Dado Valentic, and I'm a colorist, color scientist, researcher, educator in the area of color for film and television. And I have been doing this job now for more than 25 years. I started actually, before color was digital, right? So I started in this industry before color grading was a thing. I kind of discovered the whole color grading as it first evolved through my job, because what I did back in the 90s, I did an MBA in London, and then through that I got a job at Apple. And my job was to go and visit big clients, and biggest clients were post-production companies. So I discovered this whole kind of post-production world that looked very exciting, very interesting. And then somehow I got interested more into the whole post-production, and then got offered a job at Sony, which was an amazing job because I was working on a latest equipment, and I was person between the engineering team and people who were testing this new equipment. So I had access to latest toys. And there I basically saw that cinematography is going digital. And it was kind of obvious, but the technology was just not there. And actually Sony had already an amazing, digital cameras and tapes, but it was kind of delaying it because, they were selling the old models very well, and they didn't necessarily want to rush the new products on the market. They were a little bit worried, but that was kind of when HD, high definition was just being born. It was the first HD commissars. And I thought, well, this whole thing is going to change, right? It's going to go digital. It was maybe at first the digital cameras were not so good, but I clearly, had the idea, look, this is just going to get better and better. So I quit my job at Sony. I spent some time in between, just before I started my own business. I spent some time working as a kind of Mr. Wolf of Avid rental. So so basically, back in the day, companies didn't really own Avids. They would rent them, especially in film production. But these Avids would not just work, they would constantly break down, and somebody had to go and fix them and install them and do stuff like this. So, I was pretty good in figuring out why Avids didn't work and how to make them work. And that's when I got in touch with a really interesting film productions. And one of my clients was one of the first Harry Potters already back then. And that's where I started realizing what color grading is and importance of that. And so I kind of put one and one together. I was really, this is very new thing, this whole digital intermediate, as it was called then. It's so powerful in terms to what's really possible, to be done with an image. And I just thought, with advent of digital cameras, it is going to be more in demand, right? Because back then, you probably had maybe 4 or 5 places in London that were able to do proper DI. And interestingly, there was these 2 big studios, Technicolor and Deluxe, and sometimes they would even give away the eye for free just because they were making so much money from film prints. So they were competing against each other. And that basically killed only any other companies that were doing independent color grading, like who were not in business of film distribution. So there was like one really interesting company called Men in White Coats that was like doing more independent stuff, and there was like some commercials, like the big commercials houses like Motion Picture Company and Frame Store, like they were doing like a grading but on short form, and everybody else was just using some sort of television balancing. I wouldn't really call it color grading. It was mainly just kind of balancing, kind of 709 image. So yeah, I thought like, this is going to be really an area that's going to grow. And everybody thought I'm completely crazy. Everybody thought like, you can't really compete against these people. You can't compete against Technicolor Deluxe. The investment, to put together a digital grading system was millions, was because you had to have film scanners, film printers, special rooms, premises. And then again, even if you had everything, it would be very hard for you to create a business out of it, because as I said, like, the big distributors were competing for the printing work and were heavily discounting the eye. But I thought like, yes, if everything was to stay on film, it would never change. And also I noticed that there was a big resistance from all these big companies to go digital, because they were making really like all their money on distributing film on film prints, and that was millions and millions. So it was absolutely not in their interest to switch to digital cameras, nor it was in their interest to switch to digital distribution. And they were really dragging their feet. They really didn't want to adopt this new technology. They were really not interested in it. So I thought, okay, that could be an opportunity. There should be a company that is a laboratory, like we have a film laboratory, but that is a laboratory for digital cameras. And that was my kind of idea. I'll open a digital film camera laboratory. And there was not many really digital cameras back then. There was Dalsa, which was crazy big. No one really wanted to shoot with it. Then there was a Phantom camera that was gaining a lot of popularity in commercials, especially. And then this little company from the US that was using... but actually, I met that company called SI2K through a friend in Germany, who was prepping for this movie that was supposed to shoot in India called Slumdog Millionaire. And it was shot by this crazy cinematographer called Anthony.Mantle, who was normally experimenting with digital cameras, even like those kind of mini DV cameras and stuff. So he was not afraid to shoot digital. And then I got involved with the first SI2Ks. And then basically, somehow I felt like, okay, I think this is going to happen. Ari had the very first digital camera before Alexa that they were using mainly for experimentation to see how things are going to work, and so on. And I knew that Sony had a technology that was just a question of time, before this is going to hit the market. And because nobody in London would, want to teach me how to do color grading, because these people were like, so full of themselves, like, especially these film colorists. And I wasn't really interested very much in TV, because I felt like it wasn't really a lot of creative stuff going there. I thought like, well, the only way for me to learn how to do it was to go to LA. And so I did a course that taught me just the technical stuff, how to operate equipment. But it was really cool, because there I met people who showed me this new software that came out that didn't need all this expensive hardware like DaVinci would need. And it was called Final Touch, and you could run it on a Mac. And I had a friend in the UK called Lewis, who used to work for a company, Jigsaw, who helped me build this Frankenstein super duper Mac systems. And so I thought like, okay, with him I could build a DI system on a Mac platform using this software. And that was my plan. But I didn't know anything about it, and that was my biggest problem, so what I did is I by accident, really, like, somehow, coincidences, the way how it happened, I got an opportunity to learn from a senior colorist who back then was like 60 something years old. But it was absolutely wonderful person, little hippie kind of California style, which I really loved, really a little spiritual. So it wasn't really teaching me color grading like a technical, more like color grading from, human point, from perceptual point, what really color grading does. And so I worked for free for him for as long as my visa allowed me to do so, and that was really my foundation. That was really where this love for color grading was born. It was like something, that somebody told you, hey, there is this treasure trove, there is this thing, and nobody knows about it. Everybody thinks it's kind of correcting image, but actually it is about us telling story. It is like a music, it's like a soundtrack for, but in color. So that was kind of this kind of analogy, and how we through color help connect audience with a story, help tell story, help them feel emotions. And that was for me like absolutely fascinating. I love music. I come from music, and that connection, understanding. And I have a synesthesia, so for me there was always like a kind of this thing. Oh yes, I hear the color, right? I see the the sounds. I was able to really relate to it very well, and it came to me very naturally. And so I came back to London. I remortgaged my house even, and bought the first system, built some kind of, first grading system with Lewis, and I had a DI system. And my first customer was still shooting fully on film. We used an independent laboratory to do all the processing and scanning, and my first two movies were analog, were shot on film. And I used just service companies to do all the scanning and printing. And but as I said, like I was really interested in digital. That was really what I felt like this is the future. This is what we should be doing. A lot of commercials, some of them won awards because this is what digital cameras were able to. People were using digital cameras at the beginning really creatively. They were doing everything that they couldn't do with film camera. So for example, I worked on this commercial for T-Mobile that was shot at 7 p.m. on Liverpool Street, and the next evening was already on air. Like there was news about it, and after the news, they had a commercial about it. Beautifully shot back then already with SI2K. Then a Slumdog Millionaire came as well. Then I did a lot of Phantom, and also we won an award for that Nike commercial. There was like in the break of FIFA where all the big, footballers were playing against each other in super slow motion. A lot of beauty and a lot of commercials like that were using that. The BMW also was using digital cameras. It was really, really like a super interesting job, super interesting creatives, that were using it. And mainly commercials. But then I got the call from a producer of Guy Ritchie. And Guy Ritchie was shooting Sherlock Holmes. And there was one boxing scene inside, and he wanted to have this kind of slow motion, but Robert Downey Jr. being hit in super slow motion. And yeah, what you're going to do is you're going to be a Phantom. But then they told me, well, it's not just that we're going to shoot on Phantom. You have to match this Phantom to our film. Everything else was shot on film. Super underexposed, super dark. And so that was not just the kind of, for me, like a first time to do digital cameras, but also to match digital cameras to film. And, you have to understand back then there wasn't any rule books, there wasn't any like somebody who could teach you. You could maybe ask people. And luckily I had some friends, who worked in Germany for Fraunhofer, and knew much more about color and color science than I did, and somehow would build these Excel sheets really and used color charts and tried to match. It was like unbelievable. I can't believe we made it. well, actually, there is a kind of a whole opportunity here to take digital cameras as a B camera, shoot only certain scenes as long as we can match it to the rest of the film. It is actually going to be very useful. And so I started exploring more into the color management and to film emulation, because I just realized it's not just about just being able to process those images, being able to make them look as good as film. Really, that's what everybody was looking for. So I developed my first film emulation recipes that gave me a name, right? That gave me a name. Now you have to understand, the film industry as such is actually a not very big industry. There's few hundred people really who are on that top end level cinematographers. I would say probably maybe 200, 300 worldwide, who are on that really high end level, who are happy to experiment so early with digital cameras and what's possible to do with them. And so it was at the beginning a lot of word of mouth. And then somehow that word of mouth got to the British Society of Cinematographers, and then they invited me to help them do digital camera tests, and then they introduced me to cinematographers like Vittorio Storaro or Peter Hannon, who worked with the biggest cinematographers, and they were an inspiration to work with. Because they were my film school effectively that I didn't have. I by working with them, I learned how they think, what they're looking for, how they used to work in analog world, and how we could then replicate that. And an experience by working with these cinematographers then inspired me to develop this tool for film emulation. And I called it Look Designer. Initially, it was just an internal tool I used for myself, but it was allowing me to work very creatively. Again, I was just asking them, hey, what would you do normally if you were to shoot on film? And then I would then try to emulate it into digital. Not just kind of to apply the look, but also the process of look development. And then also you have these clients who really push you, who really want you to be 110% there, and that's wonderful. When you when you work, I love that period. It was really we felt like we were introducing new things, inventing new stuff, and so on. So then I started making these little boxes, with the LUTs. And that I would then rent out to cinematographers, and they would plug them between the camera and monitor. That was before the DITs were needed, and so on. So it was really interesting. And then I started doing more and more film, and especially films that needed a little bit more help. And then, really, the red camera came out, and independent cinema just became in love with that camera. And I would really say that, that the red camera itself boosted the independent film production. And also, digital cinema became reality, at least in the UK. It wasn't, interestingly enough, the digital cinema was not, again, service that you would go to Technicolor or Deluxe for. As I said, they were not interested in digital distribution, especially. So I became, I think probably the first or second facility in the UK that was able to master digital cinema as well. And then somehow my company became this shop where, we could do grading, digital cinema mastering, and distribute movies then to independent theaters. So that attracted a lot of independent filmmakers. A lot of horror movies I used to do back then. The horror movies, they made not very expensively, and they make a lot of money somehow. They're a very good business model. And these directors would do several movies a year. So they kept me really busy. now we're already like in the territory of Arri Alexa, and the moment Arri Alexa came out, everything standardized because Alexa did exactly the right thing, because what they did exactly, like everything, see, like what I learned from these cinematographers, what I learned was like, hey, as long as you make my digital camera look more like film, I'm going to use it. That was pretty much kind of the message, right? And what Ari did an incredible job in even building a color science that was so close to film negative. It was just incredible. Like, you could literally just, grade like a film neg and then put Alexa and the same settings and same grades would fit perfectly. And, that was a breakthrough. Then, you didn't really have to convince anybody anymore whether digital is going to be, thing or not. But also, like, that also made my company less kind of exclusive, right? Because digital became reality and everybody had to adopt digital, and most companies then started working digital. So, I wasn't really anymore so special. I had more experience, but, people wouldn't come to me just because I knew digital. So I figured out I need to have something that is going to separate from all the rest of the post-production companies. So I thought, okay, like if I continue innovating and if I continue doing things, then that's going to help me. And that's when I discovered color management. And color management actually was there. I saw it for the first time. There was a company called eFilm that was part of Deluxe, and they had kind of color management in their luster systems. They called them a special version of luster. And the only thing that was special was this kind of profiles for color management. And I was like, okay, this is a thing, man. We should actually really see what is that. And so I kind of, started figuring out, and I realized, oh my God, I can automate so much stuff with this. I can really, save a lot of time, remove manual labor, understand, standardized picture processing, do all sorts of things. So I was like, okay. And that was when I started developing, first color management systems. And then what happened was Game of Thrones came, and they really needed help with, their shooting schedule, because they had like sometimes 4 units, 5 units shooting simultaneously. And they wanted to send everything overnight to Canada to the visual effects company. And, the traditional, DI companies, the, big companies, they were not really equipped for that, And then, so through Game of Thrones and later through Exodus, people realized, okay, so it's not just a company like a DIT company that's going to come and just wrangle my cards, my data. What really all these productions want and need is a company that's going to manage the picture and then deliver, to the DI companies or whoever they're going to, use for final grading. And that was normally what it used to happen. Like, everybody would shoot in the UK because of the tax advantages and everything, but then they would then send stuff back to the US to do the final grading. And so my company then grew. Suddenly we were, I mean, I wasn't really doing any like a groundwork anymore. I was literally just managing, a group of DITs and dailies, and, we were like a digital lab, basically. Had this kind of, image processing skills, not just the data management skills, which was kind of the thing that most other companies had. And that, somehow became very interesting thing for British Film Institute. And they approached me. They said, what you're doing is really good, because it's making our, American clients really happy to shoot here, and they don't have to bring their own staff, that doesn't know how to work with this color managed way, which seems to be the way how companies in the US like to work. How about you create a training program, so that you educate more people in the UK how to do it. And that's how I discovered color training, or when I founded a color training, and when I started teaching some of these things. Color management, color grading, then, so it's a, yeah, and I felt like, this was wonderful because, on one side I was developing and researching things. I was then, testing it and deploying it on these high-end film projects, making sure it's working fine. And then I was then teaching, this further. So the loop was closed, and that then helped me then understand what's the next thing that I need to do and what I need to develop. And always on the lookout for the next thing, because when you're a small company, the only way you can compete is by your technical ability, really, by being able to do something that big companies can't, because they move slowly, and especially the headquarters of these big companies were not in the UK. So they would always get the latest and best stuff few years after things happen in Los Angeles. So now I was always on the lookout for what's the next thing, what's the next technology and that's happening in the industry that the big guys or other companies, that are competing in the same space are not going to be able to do or adopt as quickly. And then the stereoscopic movies came out, the 3D movies. And I thought, like, this is very interesting. And there was a company in LA called Photochem that used to be like traditional film post-production company, an analog film, that invested heavily into the 3D. And kind of that was a sign for me. I was like going like, okay, these people definitely, are know something that I don't. So if they're doing this, then I think this is the way to do it. And then I partnered with a company in Germany again called Iridas, and I built the very first stereoscopic 3D grading system in the UK. And because of that, because I was first and crazy one to doing it, I started getting the 3D jobs. And, I did the world's first 3D opera. It was an amazing job. I really loved that. And then I worked with David Attenborough on his documentary called Flying Monsters, won a BAFTA later for Best Production. And then I worked in another show called Earth Flight that won Emmy Awards for Best Natural History Documentary. And that was really like a really time for me. I was so proud of all of these achievements because I was able to take my kids to science museum to see an IMAX version of a movie that I worked on, and I don't know, I just felt like my kids were able to kind of also relate to what I was doing in life, and I also felt like that all these natural history shows were really important for the humanity. They were really like teaching us about nature, about Earth, and I had a very, very positive, experience by working on them. It was one of the, most rewarding, productions that I ever worked on. And then, like it looked like the 3D is going to go big, but then the industry killed it by taking 2D movies and just making them 3D, which looked really bad. And that kind of killed it a little bit. And lots of people didn't like the glasses. So it had a kind of a hype moment with the Avatar. That was the peak. And then after that, everything had to be 3D, but actually was a lot of bad 3D. And again, like the hype kind of brought everybody back into this. Oh, we need to do more 3D. Everybody's doing 3D and so on. And yes, I continued doing some more 3D stuff, but again, like I felt like I'm not sure if this is going to be around forever because really, in honesty, the glasses were a problem. People didn't like wearing these glasses. And then, but because Dolby was really big in 3D, I got very friendly with Dolby, and Dolby Cinema was my screening theater. And it was really cool. Like, I would go there and, shake hands with Peter Jackson, who would screen just before me and stuff like that. I even though I was a small company, something I was playing with these kind of big guys, right? And Dolby one day invited me and they said to me, hey, Dado, we want to show you something. We have this thing called Dolby Vision. I was like, what's that, And so they took me to a room and they showed me this TV that looked like, Frankenstein, like had these wires hanging out with big screws, right? But when they showed me the picture, I was like, wow, what is this? What is this? Oh, it's a high dynamic range. Dolby Vision. But it was like a prototype of Dolby Vision. So I started playing with it. It was like, it was a toy, I enjoyed. I was like, okay, So and they were quite happy that, to let me into the room and play around. And I think most of my time, actually, when I was playing with Dolby Vision, I was fixing this kind of unit that would actually do the calculation for HDR to SDR transform that somehow was crashing all the time. It was like, it was a prototype. It was a thing, we would constantly call Burbank and ask, hey, what's happening? How should we do this? And but granted, I had some experience in HDR, even very limited. I had it, and I really thought like, this is going to be good. But somebody at Dolby was incredibly good in selling it. And I was so surprised when I got a phone call from Netflix. And they said to me, oh, we want to shoot a very first HDR show. And I was thinking like, wait, hang on a moment, this is still like so beta, these technologies. Like, there were these papers and presentations, but, really practically we had very little experience with it. And amazing. I was like, okay. Netflix, tech company, right? They are like completely thinking differently, right? And not film studios. Because if you were to ask film studios, it would take another decade before first HDR would be done. But Netflix saw an opportunity. And so they said to me, would you be able to help us? We understand, we were told, that you're somebody who knows it. As I would say, no, but yeah, I probably know more than most other people, but I don't know a lot, But anyway, okay, let's do it. And they put me on this show called Marco Polo Season 2. Why? Because there was most HDR TVs back then were sold in Korea and in Japan. So not necessarily, there was not so many TVs in Europe and US, right? So they thought like, okay, if we're going to make a show, let's make a show that audience is going to be able to watch. And then, for Netflix, it was very easy to integrate HDR because all they had to do is update their software, and they had HDR. Again, if this was down to standard, way how film and TV industry was working, it would take decades, right? And then we were prepping, and actually everybody was looking at, HDR as a way to double their income, right? You know what I'm saying? Because we would like, okay, we have a normal process, the standard dynamic range process, and then we have to do HDR, and we're going to charge twice. And, so that was really what everybody thought, like, oh, this HDR thing is just going to be this kind of way for us to print money a little bit, a license. So yeah, it's exciting. Let's do it. And then I remember it was one of the kind of last meetings before we were like, I think the prep was done in Paris and then we had to go to shoot in Kuala Lumpur. And it was one of those last things. I think I was in Australia, I remember when that call happened or something like that. And that's where Netflix told us the hard truth about HDR. And they said the only way for HDR to be adopted is to cost the same as SDR. And you guys have to figure out how we're going to do that. Oh, by the way, because these are first jobs, we understand there's going to be 30% increase in budget, right? But just to cover the whole technicality of, since we're doing it for the first time. And that was like a wow. That was kind of the new generation of Hollywood, right? It's not how studios think. Like even studios would throw huge amount of money on HDR because they would hope to resell it. Like they were hoping maybe they're going to be selling Blu-ray discs for double the price because it's HDR. You understand? So studios also saw completely different business model in HDR. But Netflix, no. They were like included in your monthly $10 subscription or whatever it was. $14 maybe, I don't know. But it was like a no, and it has to cost the same. This is the tech mind, the tech people. And that was really, really one of the most challenging things. Luckily, for Netflix, I think it's still working, a color scientist called Chris Clark, who had a very good understanding of color management. And I heard of him while I was working for Warner Brothers. He was back then at the Sony Columbia. So I kind of heard of him. He's a really regarded as a top, in his domain. And then together with him, we built this workflow that minimized the amount of doubling, basically, where we would then just color grade everything once and then trim this color grade and then have a SDR and HDR version as Dolby really intended. Even though like Dolby intended it, nobody really wanted to do it like that because everybody was trying to say, no, let me do it twice to charge twice, right? But no, so somehow with Chris, we figured out the way, and that really became formula, or actually it was like a technical document to how to do HDR, right? And so think about it. We know now, probably most people who are in this industry or who have been working last few years in this industry know that HDR suddenly, started taking over. And so who's going to do it? Whom we going to hire to show us how to do it? Oh, Dado, right? And suddenly my job, stopped being just a guy who's grading, and I became more of a person that was just traveling around the world and working with different productions, post-production, studios, consulting, teaching, training. And I remember I think, British Airways sent me, this kind of golden card for my air miles, or I mean, literally, I think every week I was in another continent, not another town. It was just, my job became incredibly exciting in that way, that I worked all over the world. And I also lectured on almost every international film school, and that kind of established me as a lecturer as well. And then also that made me improve all my software and plugins and everything. So they were the first tools that industry professionals were able to use that were adapted for HDR. So then these tools that I used normally internally became adopted worldwide by, I think we had maybe 8,000 users of Look Designer, my very first software that I developed for look development, and because it worked in HDR and SDR. And, I really like that, I really enjoyed that. And at the same time, I had a facility running in London, and we were doing major Warner Brothers movies there, or my team was rather doing it. And then Warner Brothers said to me, Dado, we want to expand in London. We want to make it even bigger. And I really didn't like that. I was like, I cannot, there is enough stress, enough work, for me, just to oversee what's happening already. And now I really didn't think that, I felt that maybe my time is done on working on big movies in that way, how I used to work and running my own post-production company, or, outsourcing the services of picture post. And I felt like there is a little bit more than that in life. And then, I met on one of these conferences. British are very good in networking events, right? And I worked on an art project, nothing to do with film. I like to do, oh, by the way, I always like to do things that are not only my job, just to kind of be able to enjoy my job more, right? Because no matter what you do, when you do it every day, same thing, you at one moment you get bored with it. So I always like to have some kind of projects. Even if I were working on the biggest movie, I would do sometimes music video, or if sometimes I was doing these 3 art installation projects. I loved art, and I worked with many really big artists. I love them, I love working in art in general. And through one of these art projects, I met a founder. And now I'm going to butcher his surname, but his name is Dennis. He's Greek, and his company back then just got bought by Google. It was called DeepMind, and he was demoing like a kind of this AI machine that was playing a game, you know. But I certainly knew there's more behind it, you know, that Google wouldn't buy a company that was automating game. And Dennis was just incredibly interesting and sharp person. Like always looked like, you know, he didn't sleep the night before when you meet him. And then he invited me to their research laboratory and then showed me some of the things that they're working on, you know, on the computer vision side, or I think it was like a kind of Google kind of laboratory. And when I saw that, that's when I discovered AI. And I remember, you know, I walked out of their offices and I sat in front of it. It was like a lovely sunset. And, you know, I just felt like this is the thing I want to do. AI. And that's, you know, 2018. I mean, most people didn't even know what's AI, right? You know, kind of. But I felt like this is it. This is what I want to do. So I took that money, you know, from the sale of my company, and I came to California. Why California? Because, you know, this is where things are happening. You know, this is where startups are, where big tech companies are. You know, in London, I would maybe go to some people and say, I'm interested in doing AI. Oh, wow, what's that? I don't know, what's the AI? Oh, no, it's so stupid. Come on, man, let's go do some films, right? So no. So I came here and I knocked on the doors of Google and they gave me money. They literally like funded my research. And then I went to NVIDIA. They did the same, you know. Then I did this program called Y Combinator, which is a startup program. And I learned, you know, what it is to run a startup company, you know, what's tech companies, how this works, how that works, how this, you know, I was like learning so much and I love that. I love that. And I knew that what I got myself into is going to be really bad at the beginning. And, you know, I granted, you know, my first kind of AI models were really underperforming. But you know, you just have to have this crazy belief that one day, you know, it's going to get better, that it's going to work, you know, like, you know, that it's process of discovery, right? You know that maybe what you have right now is not the best, but you know that what you need to do next in order to make it better. So that's basically when Colourlab AI was born. And initially, I built Colourlab AI as a daily automation platform. And I went with that to Warner Brothers because I had a great working relationship with them, really. And I said, hey, you know, look, this is going to, you know, save you tons of money because you can just automate everything, upload, download, color grade, you know, transcode, everything is working. And they were like, very interesting. Let's do a test. Let's do like in parallel a project that we normally do, and then we do your project as well. And I was like, okay, fine. And we just started. I think we were on like maybe first few weeks of that project, and then COVID happens. Everything, you know, disappeared. I mean, this was just, you know, Warner Brothers was never the same after that, you know. And you know, COVID changed a lot, changed everything. And what it changed for me was the fact that I met Steve Bass during COVID. Who was this? You know, Steve Bass is this visionary who democratized editing. Like, he was responsible for Avid Media Composer. And actually, I trained on Steve Bass's method. I also finished that Avid Media Composer training. And so then he moved and he did Final Cut. And then he was responsible as well for Final Cut 10 that not everybody liked. You know, not everybody was the biggest fan of 10, but, you know, I think he was just a little bit ahead of time. But in any case, you know, Steve Bass didn't want to sit home bored. You know, he wanted to have an interesting life after Apple, and he was looking for all these startups, and he invested in my company, which is crazy. And but it was more than investment. He kind of helped me pivot from this just a system for high-end for studios to something that everybody could use on their laptop. And so we said, okay, now there is a chance for Colourlab to become a Mac application. And then during COVID, we started doing that, and we made kind of, I think, first version 1. It was interesting. It was good. I mean, it was good. Like, I would say maybe 60-70% good. And then then we released version 2 that became better in matching, but not a huge amount better, but definitely better. And that was the watershed moment for the AI. So this type of neural networks, this type of matching that we first used was so primitive in comparison to what we do today. And then, when we switched from version 2 to version 3, this was a complete rewrite. This was not the same software, not a single line of code was the same anymore. We had to, recreate everything, including the neural network. But because we did it already, it took a shorter amount of time. We were not like on discovery process. We were an improvement path. And that's usually shorter than discovery, because you kind of already think, okay, no, we know we understand what we need to do. We were just, the deep neural networks appeared, and the breakthrough for us was an encoder and decoder that would adapt itself to these new deep neural networks and tokenizing systems that we used for those. And that was a break. Once we introduced that, things just suddenly exploded, like in terms of the quality, in terms of performance. And then the company gained, huge amount of new users. And then, became like, quite difficult for us, really to maintain this user base and updates, So if you think about it, we were like a little garage, a startup that was just making software, and suddenly we had thousands and thousands of users. We made the software also very affordable, very cheap, which kind of, more users, more problems, So I really felt like, after that, I have been spending a lot of time learning about what it takes to make a software product, mass product. So everything I've done so far in my life, I was always working in high-end picture post, more or less, right? This is the world I worked in. But now, I really had to understand, how could anybody, even like your neighbor who every now and then posts a YouTube video, how could they benefit from this wonderful technology? And that was really what was obsessing me a lot, that's really where I'm looking right now with version 4, where I really want to take this is in a direction of agentic workflows, where high-end post can you see, I'm still in high-end post, I'm not moving away from that, but where they can just get things done in one go, like automate the boring stuff, but also that we can introduce this technology to mobile phones, to people who are who don't have a patience to spend years learning color grading, but want to use AI as a shortcut. That's really like my kind of understanding that this is a potential, because I think every human can look at an image and can say, oh, this is looking good or bad, right? Now, everybody has got a different taste to what's good, right? But that kind of looking good or bad, in general, most humanity agrees. Most humanity has enough understanding or feeling when they look at an image, if it's good looking or bad looking image. And you have to just understand that most people can't explain why something's looking good or bad. They can't necessarily tell you why they think this image is better than the other, right? They can't, but they can just look at something and be, wowed or in awe with something, And really, this is where most of my research has been going, because there is one thing, to develop a technology, but there is also another thing to understand the humanity, to understand, how we operate, how our brain operates, how our, neurons connect, and what, looking at an images, at stories really does to us. And this is an incredibly fascinating, part of research that goes deep into the neuroscience. And the neuroscience, by the way, is as exciting as AI. There is as much new things we're discovering about neurons and brain every day as much as we are discovering about deep neural networks. And I think, for me, that combining these two science is is really what is missing in color. We have this huge amount of experience and knowledge that we did over the decades of working in film production, and a lot of that was developed intuitively or was taught from person to person, but we never quite understood why we chose to make movies to look in a certain way. We just know that people would really like the way how we made movies look, right? All these jobs that I worked on, I know that the audience was liking it. And they would say, this is really looking good. But we never quite understood which elements of that look or that image is kind of directly connected to your brain reacting positively to it. And that's now what we're starting to understand. And interestingly, this is also kind of fascinating thing, why I'm so also obsessed with traditional analog film, is the fact that when Kodak was trying to do the same, when they basically made a color film, and they tried to simplify this process of color film processing so that it can be mass produced, first of all, but it also can be used by everybody who's not a professional photographer. That people can take photos of their families and they look at those photos and they like the way these photos look. And there was no retouching, no adjusting. It would be just a machine that would take your negative and with a standard setting would process it. And if you look at those photos, they look nothing like reality. I mean, Kodak definitely didn't try to give us realistically looking photos. They were definitely, making photos, with a distinct style. And the choice of that style, turns out, was not random. They have discovered why people would like images that look like that more than something else through psychology. And so you see, like a kind of, I find this, very similar kind of what we're trying to do is that we're trying to take a product that was used by kind of Haim Post and adapt it so that anybody can really benefit from it, that anybody can look at their images and be able to communicate better through that. And we are so dependent on videos today in a way how we communicate with the outside world. Each one of us has got some social media channels, and each one of them is exposing themselves, to the world. And many have chosen to use this method of artistic expression, or as their business, as the main source of income. And it's crazy, but YouTube today generates more revenue, than all TV and film production combined spend on their production. So like if you take all the TV production in the US, all the film production in the US, and you combine the money spent on producing that content, YouTube generates more revenue than that. it's crazy. So there is basically, we have made ourselves really dependent on image and image quality, and we definitely are not interested in learning and spending years of how to do it like professional colorists do in Hollywood, but we do know that we would like our images to look better than they look right now. So it's a great parallel there, and this is really what keeps me awake at night. This is really where my focus is at the moment, and what I enjoy researching and discovering.